Dr. Lisa Martinez stared at the ancient alien ruins through her microscope and felt her heart race with excitement. The symbols carved into the metal were unlike anything humanity had ever discovered. She was aboard the research ship UES Horizon, floating in the quiet space around Kepler 442b, and this find could change everything humans knew about alien life. Commander Jake Sullivan walked through the ship, checking on his crew. The Horizon was a peaceful vessel designed for research, not war, and Jake liked it that way. His crew of 42 people had been exploring this system for 6 months, and they had found amazing things. Lisa had discovered 3 different alien artifacts, and Chief Engineer Amy Foster had managed to keep their old ship running perfectly, despite being so far from Earth. Lieutenant Kevin Barnes sat at his communication station monitoring signals from Earth. The messages took weeks to reach them, but Kevin always listened carefully. His sister Rachel lived on New Denver Colony, and she sent him updates about her new job teaching children. Kevin smiled as he read her latest message about how the kids were learning to grow vegetables in the colony domes. Amy Foster crawled through the engine spaces, checking every system twice. She had been an engineer for 15 years, and she knew that machines could fail when you needed them most. The Horizon was her responsibility, and she would not let her crew down. The ship was old, but Amy had replaced and upgraded almost everything during their long journey. Jake was reading reports in his quarters when the emergency alarm started screaming through the ship. He ran to the bridge where Kevin was staring at his screen with a pale face. The young lieutenant turned to Jake with tears in his eyes and said the words that would change everything for humanity. Earth Command was reporting that 3 human colonies had been attacked without warning. New Denver, Port Victoria, and Harmony Station were gone. The attackers had used weapons that turned the colony domes into glass and killed everyone inside within minutes. Over 2 million people were dead, including children, families, and workers who had never hurt anyone. Lisa ran onto the bridge when she heard the alarm and saw Kevin crying at his station. She asked what was wrong, and Jake told her about the attacks. Lisa felt sick when she realized that so many innocent people had died for no reason. These were not military targets, but peaceful colonies where families lived and worked. Amy heard the news over the ship communication system and felt anger building in her chest like a fire. She had friends on Port Victoria who worked as engineers, like her. They were good people who helped build better lives for everyone, and now they were dead. Amy hit the wall with her fist and felt pain shoot through her hand, but the anger was stronger than the pain. The alien attackers had sent a message to Earth that was broadcast to every human ship and colony. The message was simple and cold. The aliens called themselves the Zephyrian Collective, and they said that human expansion into space had to stop. Humans could submit to Zephyrian rule, or they could face complete destruction. There would be no negotiation and no mercy. Jake gathered his crew in the main meeting room and told them everything Earth Command had reported. The attacks had happened at exactly the same time across 3 different star systems. The Zephyrian ships had appeared without warning, destroyed the colonies completely, and then disappeared back into space. No human ship had been able to track them or fight back. Kevin asked if his sister was really dead, and Jake had to tell him that everyone on New Denver was gone. The young man broke down crying, and Amy put her arm around his shoulders. Lisa felt tears on her own face as she thought about all the families that had been destroyed. These people had left Earth to build new lives among the stars, and now they were all dead. The crew talked about what they should do next. Earth Command had ordered all research ships to return home immediately, but that would take months. Jake knew that Earth was probably preparing for war and that the Horizon would be needed. Amy said she could push the engines harder to get them home faster, but it would be dangerous. Lisa looked at the alien artifacts she had been studying and wondered if these ancient ruins belonged to another species that the Zephyrians had destroyed. Maybe humanity was just the latest target in a long history of Zephyrian expansion. She felt fear and anger mixing together as she realized that her peaceful life as a scientist might be over forever. Jake made the decision to head for Earth at maximum speed. He knew his crew was hurting and angry, but they had a job to do. The sea. Horizon might be a research ship, but it was still a human ship, and Earth needed every vessel it could get. The war had started whether humans wanted it or not, and now they had to decide how to fight back. As the Horizon turned toward Earth, Jake looked at his crew and saw the pain in their eyes turning into something harder and more dangerous. 6 months had passed since the Zephyrian attack, and Earth looked like a different world. Admiral Helen Carter stood on the bridge of her flagship UES Retribution and watched hundreds of human warships moving into formation. The largest fleet in human history was ready to strike back at the aliens who had murdered millions of innocent people. Commander Jake Sullivan now commanded the UES Horizon, which had been upgraded with weapons and armor during their time at Earth. His peaceful research ship was now a destroyer capable of fighting the Zephyrians. Jake felt strange seeing laser cannons where scientific equipment used to be, but he knew the change was necessary. Lieutenant Kevin Barnes had requested transfer to the weapons division and spent his days learning how to kill Zephyrians efficiently. The young man who used to smile and joke with his crewmates was now cold and focused on revenge. He practiced targeting drills for hours and studied Zephyrian ship designs looking for weak points to exploit. Dr. Lisa Martinez had been assigned as a xenopsychology advisor to help the fleet understand their alien enemies. She studied every piece of information about Zephyrian behavior and culture, but found them difficult to understand. The aliens seemed to think like computers, making decisions based only on logic and efficiency, without any emotion. Chief Engineer Amy Foster worked 20 hours a day keeping the ships ready for battle. The Earth shipyards had built new vessels, faster than ever before, but many systems were untested and unreliable. Amy and thousands of other engineers worked to fix problems and improve weapons before the fleet reached Zephyrian space. Admiral Carter had been chosen to lead Operation Thunderstrike because she understood that this war was about survival, not just victory. The Zephyrians had made it clear that they would accept nothing less than human surrender or extinction. Carter knew that her fleet had to hit the aliens hard and fast before they could attack more human colonies. The fleet jumped into hyperspace, heading for the Zephyrian border systems, where intelligence reports suggested military bases were located. Jake felt his stomach twist as the stars changed around them, and he knew that many of his friends would not survive the coming battle. But the anger in his heart was stronger than his fear. When the human fleet arrived at the first Zephyrian system, they found orbital platforms and warships waiting for them. The aliens had known they were coming, but Admiral Carter did not care about surprise anymore. She ordered her ships to attack with everything they had, and the space around the planet lit up with weapons fire. Jake led his squadron of converted research ships against a Zephyrian cruiser twice their size. The alien ship fired precisely aimed beams that could cut through human armor like paper, but Jake ordered his ships to charge straight at the enemy. The human crews fought with desperate fury that made them ignore damage and casualties. Kevin Barnes controlled the Horizon weapons and targeted the Zephyrian ship engines with single-minded determination. He did not care about tactics or strategy, but only wanted to kill the aliens who had murdered his sister. When his first shots missed, he screamed in frustration and fired again until the enemy ship began to burn. The Zephyrians found themselves facing an enemy that fought like wild animals instead of trained soldiers. Human ships ignored their own safety and rammed into alien vessels when their weapons failed. Crews continued fighting even when their ships were crippled and life support was failing. The cold, logical alien minds could not understand such behavior. Amy Foster kept the Horizon running when half the ship systems were destroyed by enemy fire. She crawled through damaged corridors with sparks falling around her and rerouted power to the weapons no matter what else had to be shut down. When Jake asked if the ship could keep fighting, Amy just nodded and went back to work. The first battle was a human victory, but the cost was terrible. 20% of the fleet was destroyed or crippled, and thousands of crew members were dead. Jake looked at the twisted metal that used to be human ships and felt his anger grow even stronger. The Zephyrians would pay for every human life they had taken. Admiral Carter was pleased with the results, despite the losses. The human forces had destroyed the Zephyrian base and captured important intelligence about alien technology and tactics. More importantly, they had proven that humans could fight and win against their supposedly superior enemies. Over the following months, the human fleet attacked 6 more Zephyrian positions and won each battle through sheer aggressive determination. The aliens seemed confused by human tactics that emphasized emotion over logic and sacrifice over self-preservation. Zephyrian commanders began to retreat when faced with human assaults instead of standing and fighting. Lisa Martinez studied the battle reports and noticed patterns in how the Zephyrians responded to human attacks. The aliens were adapting to human emotional tactics faster than she had expected. She tried to warn Admiral Carter that their current approach might not work forever, but the Admiral was focused on pressing their advantage. Kevin Barnes had become one of the most effective gunners in the fleet, but his fellow crew members were worried about him. He rarely spoke except to request more ammunition, and he studied recordings of dead Zephyrians during his off-duty hours. Amy tried to talk to him, but Kevin only wanted to discuss new ways to kill their enemies. Jake noticed that his crew was changing in ways that worried him. The anger that drove them to fight so effectively was also making them harder and less human. But every time he thought about stopping, he remembered the destroyed colonies and the murdered families, and his doubt disappeared. The Zephyrians were learning from their defeats and beginning to develop new strategies to counter human emotional warfare. War Prime Zeltak studied human behavior and realized that the same fury that made humans dangerous in battle could also be used against them. The real war was just beginning. 1 year into the war, everything had changed, and not in the way humans had hoped. Admiral Helen Carter floated in a damaged escape pod, watching her flagship UES Retribution burn and break apart in space. The Zephyrians had learned to predict human anger and use it against them with devastating effectiveness. War Prime Zeltak had studied human behavior for months and discovered that emotional responses followed patterns that could be calculated and manipulated. The Zephyrian commander began setting traps that used human fury against them. When human ships charged in rage, they found themselves surrounded by carefully positioned enemy forces that destroyed them with cold efficiency. Commander Jake Sullivan received an emergency promotion to admiral when his superior officers were killed in the latest disaster. He now commanded what remained of the human fleet, but the ships were damaged and the crews were demoralized. The rage that had once driven them to victory now seemed like a weakness that their enemies exploited. Lieutenant Kevin Barnes had requested permission to lead a special mission to rescue prisoners from a Zephyrian facility. Intelligence reports suggested that humans from the destroyed colonies were being held there for experiments. Kevin convinced himself that his sister might still be alive and gathered volunteers for an unauthorized attack. Dr. Lisa Martinez tried to warn Kevin that the prisoner facility was obviously a trap, but he would not listen to her concerns. The young man had become obsessed with revenge and could no longer think clearly about tactics or strategy. He saw only targets to destroy and enemies to kill without considering the consequences. Chief Engineer Amy Foster worked desperately to keep the remaining human ships functional, but the constant battles had worn down every system. She had not slept properly in weeks, and her hands shook from exhaustion as she tried to repair critical components. The fleet was falling apart, and she could not fix everything alone. Kevin led his squadron of 12 ships toward the Zephyrian prisoner facility, convinced that he was finally going to rescue his sister and strike a meaningful blow against the enemy. The facility appeared to be lightly defended, which should have warned him that something was wrong, but his anger made him ignore obvious signs of danger. The moment Kevin's ships entered the system, hundreds of Zephyrian vessels appeared from hiding places behind asteroids and moons. The human squadron was completely surrounded and outnumbered by more than 20 to 1. Kevin realized too late that he had led his volunteers into a carefully planned trap designed to exploit his desperate need for revenge. The battle lasted only minutes before every human ship was destroyed or crippled beyond repair. Kevin survived in a damaged escape pod and was forced to watch his friends die because of his reckless decision. The Zephyrians broadcast recordings of the battle to demoralize other human forces and show them what happened to those who let emotion control their actions. Jake received the news of Kevin's failed mission while dealing with reports that 3 more human colonies had fallen to Zephyrian attacks. The aliens were advancing toward Earth itself, and the human fleet was too weak to stop them. Jake felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on him as he realized that humanity might actually lose this war. Amy Foster was working in the engine room when she heard about Kevin's squadron being destroyed. She stopped what she was doing and sat down on the floor feeling overwhelmed by sadness and exhaustion. So many good people had died, and she was not sure if their sacrifices meant anything anymore. Lisa Martinez presented her analysis to the surviving human leadership on Earth. The Zephyrians had learned to weaponize human emotions against them. Every time humans fought with rage and fury, they became predictable and vulnerable to alien tactics. The current approach was leading humanity toward complete defeat. Admiral Carter was rescued from space, but she had been badly injured when her ship was destroyed. She told Jake that the war could not be won through anger alone. The Zephyrians were too smart and too patient to be defeated by emotional tactics. Humanity needed to find a different way to fight. Kevin was eventually rescued and brought back to the fleet, but he was a broken man. The young officer who had once been eager and optimistic was now consumed by guilt over the deaths he had caused. He spent his time staring at nothing and refused to talk about what had happened during the failed mission. Jake found himself commanding a fleet that had lost most of its ships and almost all of its confidence. The crews were exhausted and demoralized, while the Zephyrians grew stronger every day. Earth Command was demanding results, but Jake had no victories to report, only casualties and retreats. Amy continued working to keep the ships running, but she began to change her approach. Instead of rushing to complete repairs, she took time to do things properly and make sure they would last. She noticed that careful, steady work produced better results than frantic emergency fixes driven by desperation. Lisa spent her time studying not just Zephyrian behavior, but human history, looking for examples of how people had overcome seemingly impossible challenges. She found stories of humans who had endured terrible hardships through determination and persistence rather than anger and violence. These people had achieved great things by refusing to give up no matter how difficult things became. The Zephyrians continued their advance toward Earth, confident that they had learned to counter human emotional responses. War Prime Zeltak believed that victory was inevitable because humans could not change their fundamental nature. But he had not yet encountered what humans were truly capable of when they moved beyond rage toward something much more dangerous. Jake called a meeting of his remaining officers and told them that their current approach was not working. They had tried to win through fury and hatred, but the Zephyrians had turned those emotions against them. It was time to try something different, even if it meant abandoning everything they thought they knew about fighting this war. The human fleet retreated toward Earth, but they were not running away in defeat. They were preparing to discover what made humanity truly formidable. 2 years into the war, Admiral Jake Sullivan stood before a group of new recruits and spoke words that would have seemed impossible when the fighting began. He told them that hatred and anger were not going to win this war. The young men and women listened carefully as Jake explained that they needed to fight with their minds clear and their purpose steady. Dr. Lisa Martinez had worked with the surviving military psychologists to develop new training methods based on her study of human history. Instead of teaching soldiers to channel their rage, she taught them about people who had built great things through patient determination. She told them about engineers who worked for decades to construct bridges and scientists who spent lifetimes seeking answers to difficult questions. Lieutenant Kevin Barnes had spent months recovering from his breakdown after leading his squadron into the Zephyrian trap. The guilt and shame had nearly destroyed him, but slowly he began to understand that his sister would not want him to throw away his life seeking revenge. Kevin started helping other soldiers learn from his mistakes and find better ways to honor their dead. Chief Engineer Amy Foster had become an example for others through her steady approach to keeping ships running under impossible conditions. She never panicked or rushed her work even when enemy fire was hitting the hull around her. Amy fixed what could be fixed and found alternatives when repairs were impossible. Her calm determination inspired others to work the same way. The first test of the new approach came when Jake received orders to defend Proxima Station from an incoming Zephyrian attack. Instead of charging toward the enemy fleet, Jake positioned his ships carefully and waited for the aliens to come to him. His officers questioned the passive strategy, but Jake insisted that patience would be more effective than aggression. War Prime. Zeltak led the Zephyrian assault expecting to face the same emotional human tactics that had proven so easy to counter. Instead, he found human ships moving in careful formations that advanced steadily, despite taking heavy damage. The humans absorbed losses without breaking or retreating, but they also did not charge blindly into obvious traps. Kevin served as a gunnery officer during the battle and found that he could think more clearly when he was not consumed by hatred for the enemy. He targeted Zephyrian ships, methodically working to disable their weapons and engines rather than simply trying to destroy them as quickly as possible. His accurate fire contributed significantly to the human defensive success. Amy kept the human ships running throughout the long battle by refusing to panic when systems failed. She worked steadily to reroute power and repair damage, while explosions shook the ship around her. When other engineers asked how she stayed so calm, Amy told them that ships were just machines, and machines could always be fixed if you understood how they worked. The Zephyrians found themselves facing something they had not expected. Human ships continued advancing even when they were heavily damaged, and their crews were taking casualties. But instead of the wild charges they had learned to counter, the humans moved with disciplined persistence that was much harder to predict or exploit. Jake watched the battle develop and saw that his new strategy was working. The Zephyrians were used to human forces that either retreated in panic or attacked in fury. They did not know how to handle enemies who simply kept coming forward no matter what happened to them. The alien formation began to waver as their commanders struggled to adapt. Lisa monitored Zephyrian communications during the battle and noted confusion in their tactical discussions. The aliens could not understand why humans continued fighting when logic suggested they should either flee or surrender. The steady human advance did not fit any of the behavioral patterns that War Prime Zeltak had programmed into his strategic computers. When the battle ended, the Zephyrians had retreated for the first time since learning to counter human emotional tactics. They had not been defeated, but they had failed to achieve their objectives against an enemy that refused to behave according to their predictions. Jake knew this was just the beginning, but it proved that humans could fight differently. Kevin felt something change inside himself during the battle. Instead of the burning hatred that had driven him for months, he experienced a calm sense of purpose. He was still fighting for his dead sister, but now he was fighting to honor her memory by protecting others rather than simply seeking revenge against her killers. Amy was promoted to Chief Engineering Officer for the entire remaining fleet because her methods had proven so effective. She began training other engineers to approach their work with the same steady determination that had kept ships running during the worst battles. Amy taught them that panic was the enemy of good engineering, and that careful work saved more lives than heroic gestures. War Prime Zeltak analyzed the battle data and found himself unable to explain what had happened. His strategic models could predict human behavior when it was driven by emotion, but this new approach seemed to follow different rules entirely. The calculated persistence and unwavering advance of human forces presented problems that his logical mind struggled to solve. Jake realized that they had discovered something important about what made humans truly dangerous. It was not their capacity for violence or their emotional responses that made them formidable. It was their ability to keep going when any reasonable species would give up. Humans could endure losses and setbacks that would break other beings and still continue pursuing their goals. The human fleet began implementing the new training methods throughout all their forces. Soldiers learned to fight with clear minds and steady hearts rather than blind fury. Engineers approached their work with patient determination. Scientists continued their research even when laboratories were destroyed and data was lost. Lisa noticed that the change was affecting more than just military operations. Human colonies that had been hiding from Zephyrian attacks began sending messages that they were still alive and still resisting. Families who had lost everything in the initial strikes were rebuilding and refusing to surrender, despite having every reason to give up hope. The war was far from over, but something fundamental had shifted in how humans approached the conflict. They were no longer fighting because they were angry. They were fighting because they had decided to win, and nothing the Zephyrians could do would change that decision. This was a much more dangerous enemy than anything the aliens had faced before. 3 years into the war, Admiral Jake Sullivan stood in the command center of his flagship watching holographic displays show the slow but steady advance of human forces across Zephyrian space. Every system they reclaimed had cost lives and ships, but the humans kept moving forward with a determination that seemed to puzzle their alien enemies more each day. The war had become something different than anyone had expected. Instead of the quick victory the Zephyrians had planned or the desperate, last stand humans had feared, the conflict had turned into a test of endurance between two very different species. The aliens had superior technology and numbers, but humans had something the Zephyrians could not understand or counter. Captain Kevin Barnes led a special operations unit that conducted missions behind enemy lines for months at a time. His teams survived by working together and never giving up no matter how difficult conditions became. Kevin had learned to fight with patience instead of anger, and his soldiers followed his example of quiet determination. Chief Engineer Amy Foster had been promoted to Chief of Fleet Engineering and now oversaw the repair and maintenance of hundreds of ships. Her philosophy of steady, careful work had spread throughout the human fleet. Engineers no longer rushed to complete repairs, but took the time to do things properly even when battles were raging around them. Dr. Lisa Martinez continued her research into Zephyrian psychology while also studying reports from the front lines. She had discovered that the aliens were becoming demoralized by human persistence in ways that their logical minds could not process. The Zephyrians had expected either quick victory or honorable defeat, but humans refused to provide either outcome. War Prime Zeltak found himself facing an enemy that grew stronger through suffering rather than weaker. Every time his forces inflicted casualties on human units, the survivors seemed to become more determined rather than more desperate. His strategic computers could not model this behavior because it defied basic principles of logical military thinking. Jake had developed a new approach to warfare that emphasized steady pressure rather than dramatic victories. Human forces advanced, methodically through Zephyrian space, reclaiming one system at a time. When they encountered strong resistance, they simply waited and found another way forward. When their ships were damaged, they repaired them and continued fighting. The liberation of the Kepler 442 system, where the war had begun for Jake Crew, became a symbol of the new human approach. Instead of a massive assault, Jake surrounded the system and waited. For 6 months, human ships maintained their positions despite constant Zephyrian attacks. The aliens eventually abandoned their bases rather than continue fighting an enemy that would never retreat. Amy worked with engineering teams throughout the fleet to keep ships operational under conditions that should have been impossible. When hulls were breached, her teams found ways to seal them. When engines failed, they built new ones from salvaged parts. When weapons were destroyed, they created alternatives using whatever materials were available. Kevin's special operations teams discovered that many human colonies thought to be completely destroyed actually had survivors who had been hiding underground for years. These people had endured terrible hardships, but they had never stopped resisting Zephyrian occupation. Their persistence inspired the military forces and provided valuable intelligence about enemy movements. The Zephyrians began showing signs of something their species had never experienced before. Individual aliens started questioning orders and making mistakes in combat. Some Zephyrian commanders requested transfers away from sectors where they had to fight humans. War Prime Zeltak realized that his people were developing what humans called demoralization. Lisa analysis of captured Zephyrian communications revealed that the aliens were struggling to understand how humans could continue fighting after suffering such enormous losses. The logical Zephyrian mind could not comprehend a species that treated setbacks as temporary obstacles rather than permanent defeats. This incomprehension was becoming a strategic weakness. Jake received reports that human colonies throughout the galaxy were emerging from hiding to provide support for the liberation effort. Families who had lost everything were contributing whatever they could to help the war effort. Children who had grown up during the conflict were volunteering for dangerous missions with the same quiet determination their parents had shown. The battle for the Zeta Reticuli system lasted 8 months and became the longest single engagement in human military history. Zephyrian forces held strong defensive positions that should have been impossible to assault. But human forces simply kept attacking day after day, making small advances and never retreating even when casualties were severe. Amy engineers worked miracles keeping damaged ships operational throughout the extended battle. When the main engines of the flagship were destroyed, her team built a new propulsion system using parts from 3 different wrecked vessels. When life support failed, they created backup systems using equipment salvaged from abandoned Zephyrian stations. Kevin teams operated behind Zephyrian lines during the entire 8-month battle, providing intelligence and conducting sabotage missions. They survived by helping each other and refusing to give up no matter how hopeless their situation seemed. When they were cut off from supplies, they found ways to live off the land and continue their mission. The Zephyrians finally abandoned Zeta Reticuli not because they were defeated in battle, but because they could no longer tolerate the psychological pressure of fighting an enemy that would never stop coming. War Prime Zeltak ordered the retreat against the advice of his subordinates, who warned that it would be seen as a sign of weakness. Lisa discovered through her research that humans were not just winning battles, but changing the fundamental nature of the war itself. The conflict was no longer about military superiority or technological advantage. It had become a contest between Zephyrian logic and human persistence, and the humans were proving that some things were more powerful than rational. Jake realized that they had found humanity true strength in warfare. It was not their weapons or their tactics or their courage. It was their absolute refusal to accept defeat no matter what happened to them. This trait made humans more dangerous than any military technology because it meant they would keep fighting until they won. The Zephyrian collective began experiencing internal conflicts as different factions argued about how to handle the human threat. Some aliens wanted to negotiate while others demanded more aggressive tactics. War Prime Zeltak found his authority questioned for the first time in his career as his people struggled to understand why they could not defeat such a supposedly inferior species. As the 4th year of the war began, Jake looked at the strategic displays and saw that human forces now controlled nearly half of the territory they had lost in the initial attacks. The advance continued slowly, but it never stopped and it never reversed. The Zephyrians were learning what it meant to fight, an enemy that simply would not quit. 5 years after the first Zephyrian attack, Admiral Jake Sullivan received a message that surprised everyone in the human fleet. War Prime Zeltak was requesting a meeting to discuss terms for ending the conflict. The aliens who had once demanded complete human surrender were now asking to negotiate a peace treaty. The war had not ended with a climactic battle or a dramatic victory. Instead, it had concluded through the gradual realization by the Zephyrian collective that they could not defeat an enemy that refused to stay defeated. Human forces had reclaimed almost all of their lost territory through sheer determination, and the aliens had finally accepted that continuing the fight was pointless. Captain Amy Foster now commanded her own ship after years of proving that steady determination was more valuable than brilliant tactics. The former engineer had become one of the most respected officers in the fleet, not because she won spectacular victories, but because she never failed to complete her missions no matter how difficult they became. Captain Kevin Barnes served as Amy First Officer, having found peace with himself through years of patient service. The young man who had once been consumed by hatred for the Zephyrians now felt only a quiet satisfaction that justice had been achieved for his sister and all the other victims of the initial attacks. Dr. Lisa Martinez was chosen as the chief human negotiator for the peace talks because of her deep understanding of both species. She had spent years studying Zephyrian psychology and had concluded that the aliens were not evil, but simply unable to comprehend the human capacity for persistence in the face of overwhelming adversity. The peace conference took place aboard a neutral space station in a system controlled by neither humans nor Zephyrians. Jake accompanied Lisa as the military representative, while War Prime Zeltak brought his own advisors. The alien commander looked older and more tired than the intelligence reports had suggested. War Prime Zeltak began the negotiations by admitting something that shocked the human delegation. He told them that the Zephyrian collective had never encountered a species like humanity before. Most alien civilizations surrendered when faced with superior firepower or retreated when they suffered significant casualties. Humans had done neither, and this had fundamentally confused Zephyrian strategic thinking. Lisa asked War Prime Zeltak why the Zephyrians had attacked human colonies in the first place. The alien commander explained that his people had observed human expansion and concluded that Earth was becoming a potential threat to Zephyrian interests. The attacks were intended to stop human growth before it could challenge alien dominance. Jake wanted to know why the Zephyrians had not simply tried to negotiate boundaries or establish trade relationships instead of resorting to violence. War Prime Zeltak said that his people had assumed humans would respond to superior force the same way other species had. The idea that humans might fight back effectively had not been considered a serious possibility. The negotiations continued for weeks, as both sides worked to establish terms that would prevent future conflicts. Lisa proposed that the agreement should include reparations for the destroyed colonies and guarantees that neither species would attack the other without provocation. War Prime Zeltak agreed to these terms more easily than anyone had expected. Amy and Kevin remained with the fleet during the peace talks, ready to resume fighting if the negotiations failed. But they could see that something had changed in the Zephyrian forces. The aliens no longer moved with the confident precision they had shown early in the war. Their formation were looser, and their responses were slower, as if they were no longer sure of themselves. War Prime Zeltak made a statement during the final session that revealed how much the war had changed Zephyrian thinking. He said that his people had learned to fear human unpredictability and emotional responses, but they had not understood the true danger until it was too late. Humans were not dangerous because they were angry or violent, but because they simply would not stop. Lisa asked what War Prime Zeltak meant, and the alien commander explained that Zephyrian military doctrine was based on logical analysis of costs and benefits. When losses exceeded acceptable levels or victory became unlikely, Zephyrian forces would withdraw to preserve resources for more favorable battles. Humans seemed incapable of making such rational calculations. Jake realized that War Prime Zeltak was describing the fundamental difference between their species. Zephyrians fought until fighting no longer made logical sense. Humans fought until they won regardless of what logic suggested about their chances. This difference had ultimately determined the outcome of the war. The peace treaty was signed with ceremonies broadcast to both civilizations. Humans celebrated not just the end of the fighting, but the knowledge that they had proven themselves capable of standing against any threat. The Zephyrians accepted the agreement with what seemed like relief that they no longer had to face such an incomprehensible enemy. Amy was promoted to admiral and given command of the fleet responsible for rebuilding the liberated territories. She approached this task with the same patient determination that had carried her through the war. The destroyed colonies would be rebuilt, and they would be stronger than before because the people building them had learned what they were truly capable of achieving. Kevin chose to remain in the military and was assigned to train new officers in the lessons learned during the war. He taught them that victory came not from superior firepower or brilliant tactics, but from the simple refusal to accept defeat. His students learned that persistence was humanity's greatest weapon and their most valuable trait. Jake returned to Earth as a hero, but he was more interested in the future than in celebrating past victories. He knew that humanity would encounter other alien species as they continued expanding into the galaxy. The next aliens they met would have heard about the war with the Zephyrians and would know that humans were not a species to be underestimated. Lisa continued her research into alien psychology and began preparing for humanity's next encounters with other civilizations. She had learned that different species would present different challenges, but she was confident that human determination would prove equal to whatever they might face. The war had taught her that persistence could overcome almost any obstacle. The rebuilt colonies became symbols of human resilience and determination. Families returned to worlds that had been devastated and began building new lives among the ruins of the old. Children grew up hearing stories about the war and learning that their species had faced extinction but had refused to surrender. As Jake looked back on the 5 years of conflict, he realized that humanity had discovered something important about itself. They were not the strongest or smartest or most advanced species in the galaxy, but they possessed a quality that made them ultimately unconquerable. When humans decided to achieve something, they would keep working toward that goal until it was accomplished, no matter how long it took or what obstacles they encountered. The Zephyrians had feared human rage, but they should have feared human resolve because resolve was unstoppable.